The human mind does not break with a blow. It fractures slowly, methodically, under the calculated pressure of someone who understands that true power does not reside in brute force, but in the ability to reconfigure another person's internal reality until they can no longer distinguish between their own will and the one that has been implanted in them. This is not abstract theory nor philosophical speculation. It is the documented record of real cases where individuals with absolute power, whether institutional, physical, or psychological, have applied such sophisticated mind control techniques that their victims ended up not only obeying, but passionately defending their own enslavement. History is filled with these cases, archived in legal files, documented in testimonies, studied by psychologists who can barely articulate the horror of what they are observing. And the pattern that emerges from all these cases, separated by decades and continents, is so consistent that it reveals something terrifying about the architecture of the human psyche. We are infinitely more vulnerable to external control than we like to admit. The case of Joseph Fritzl remains one of the most extreme and well-documented examples of sustained psychological control in modern history. For 24 years, this man kept his own daughter imprisoned in a specially designed basement beneath his house in Austria. But the physical details of the captivity, no matter how horrific, are secondary to the true psychological experiment he was conducting. Fritzl did not simply lock up his daughter, he reconstructed her psychologically from scratch. He began the process when she was 18 years old, at a crucial moment when adult identity was just beginning to solidify. He lured her to the basement with a pretext, drugged her, and when she woke up, her previous reality had ended. The outside world still existed. Her mother literally lived upstairs. But for Elizabeth Fritzl, that world had become as inaccessible as if she had been transported to another planet. Fritzl understood something fundamental about psychological control that many captors failed to grasp. Hope must be carefully managed. Too much hope, and the victim continues to resist, seeking escape, keeping their previous identity alive. No hope at all, and the victim completely disintegrates, becomes useless, potentially suicidal. The perfect balance is to maintain enough hope for the victim to keep functioning, but never enough to attempt escape. Fritzl achieved this balance through a system of rewards and punishments so calibrated that it functioned like a behavioral algorithm. When Elizabeth behaved as he wished, conditions in the basement marginally improved. More food, some entertainment, the possibility of seeing her children born in that dungeon. When she did not cooperate, the punishment was the threat that her children would suffer. He didn't need to beat her constantly. I needed to create a system where she herself would become the guardian of her own obedience. The children born in that basement added an extra layer of control that Fritzl exploited with surgical precision. Elizabeth couldn't escape without them, and escaping with them seemed impossible. But beyond the physical logistics, those children became psychological anchors. Her need to care for them gave her a purpose, a reason to keep functioning in conditions that would otherwise have completely destroyed her. Fritzl allowed her to be a mother because he knew that would keep her stable, functional, and obedient. And it worked for over 2 decades. When the case was finally uncovered, it wasn't because Elizabeth managed to escape through a heroic act of resistance. It was because one of the children fell seriously ill, and Fritzl made the mistake of taking her to a hospital where the doctors started asking questions. The system didn't fail due to internal weakness. It failed because of a miscalculation by the perpetrator. This control pattern, through careful management of hope and despair, repeatedly appears in cases of prolonged kidnapping. Ariel Castro in Cleveland, Ohio, kept 3 women captive for about a decade, using almost identical techniques. He physically chained them, yes, but the physical chains were redundant. The real chains were psychological. He isolated them from each other to prevent solidarity. He rewarded them with minor privileges for obedience. He savagely punished them for imaginary transgressions to keep them in a state of constant vigilance. And crucially, he alternated between extreme violence and periods of relative calm in a completely unpredictable manner. This unpredictability was not random cruelty. It was behavioral engineering. The human brain desperately seeks patterns that allow it to anticipate and prepare. When patterns are not found, when violence can erupt at any moment without correlation to the victim's behavior, the nervous system goes into perpetual collapse. But these cases of physical captivity, no matter how extreme, are only the most obvious manifestation of psychological control dynamics that operate in much broader and seemingly normal contexts. The case of Colonia Dignidad in Chile reveals how these techniques can be applied not to a single person, but to an entire community. Paul Schaefer, a former Nazi who established this colony in 1961, created what was essentially a psychological concentration camp disguised as a religious community. For more than 4 decades, he maintained absolute control over hundreds of people, not through armed guards in watchtowers, although he had them, but by constructing an alternative reality so complete that the residents lost the capacity to conceive of existence outside of it. Schaefer applied mind control principles that are surprisingly consistent with those we document in individual cases, only scaled up. He separated families, especially parents, from their children, destroying primary bonds that could compete with his authority. He controlled all information entering the colony, creating an informational environment where he was the only source of truth about the outside world. He implemented exhausting physical work that kept residents too tired to think critically. He used public punishments that served both to discipline the transgressor and to terrify observers. And, perhaps more insidiously, he used religious language to morally recode the entire system of oppression. Obedience to Schaefer was not submission to a dictator, it was obedience to God. Resistance was not legitimate self-defense, it was mortal sin. Questioning was not critical thinking, it was the voice of the demon. This moral recoding is one of the most powerful tools of psychological control because it attacks the victim's very ability to name their own experience. If the language available to describe the abuse presents it as love, if the accessible mental categories interpret exploitation as sacred service, then the victim loses the cognitive tools necessary to even recognize that they are being victimized. It is not that the victim is stupid or in denial. It is that the conceptual map they would need to navigate toward freedom has been systematically denied to them. The testimonies of those who finally escaped from Colonia Dignidad reveal a process of awakening that is painfully slow and fragmented. It is not a moment of sudden revelation. It is a series of small fissures in the constructed reality, each generating more anxiety than clarity. The person begins to notice inconsistencies. The leader who preaches humility lives in luxury, while others subsist in poverty. The teachings about love are accompanied by brutal violence. The promises of salvation require endless suffering. But noticing these inconsistencies is not enough. The mind, having invested years or decades in the belief system, resists the evidence that contradicts it. Cognitive dissonance generates not clarity, but confusion, not liberation, but guilt. The person assumes that if there is contradiction, it must be because they do not understand correctly, because their faith is weak, because they are being tempted by evil forces. This capacity of the mind to defend the system that oppresses it appears with terrifying consistency in all cases of extreme psychological control. Victims of destructive cults often require months or years of intensive therapeutic deprogramming after escaping. And many never escape completely. Some return to the cult. Others spend the rest of their lives trapped between two realities, unable to fully inhabit either. The part of them that was reconstructed within the cult does not simply disappear because the body has physically left. That cultivated identity continues to live in their psyche, sometimes dominant, sometimes latent, but always present. The case of the so-called comfort women during World War II provides historical evidence of how these control mechanisms are institutionalized on a massive scale. The Japanese army established a system of sexual slavery where women, many of whom were barely teenagers, were captured or deceived and forced to serve in military brothels. But the malicious genius of the system was not only in the physical violence, which was extreme. It lay in the psychological structure that ensured the victim's complicity. The women were categorized into hierarchies based on their cooperation. Those who resisted received the worst treatment, were assigned to the most violent soldiers, and were kept in the worst conditions. Those who resigned themselves received marginally better treatment, better food, and occasionally small freedoms. The message was clear. Your suffering can either worsen infinitely or be marginally tolerable, and the difference depends entirely on your level of cooperation. This system generated exactly what it was designed to generate: women who monitored their own behavior more rigorously than any external guard could. Women who suppressed any impulse to resist, not because they lacked courage, but because they had correctly calculated that resistance would only multiply their suffering without any realistic chance of escape. And, more insidiously, women who began to identify small advantages in their situation, moments of relative dignity or security, and clung to those moments as evidence that not everything was absolute horror, that there were ways to exist within the system with something resembling agency. The perpetrators intuitively understood that complete destruction of the victim is counterproductive. A completely destroyed person is useless. A person who retains enough sense of self to experience humiliation, enough hope to value small mercies, enough fear to avoid punishments, that person can be used indefinitely. The art of extreme psychological control lies in keeping the victim in that liminal space between annihilation and autonomy, where they are never destroyed enough to become dysfunctional, but never intact enough to resist effectively. Decades after the war, when some of these women finally began to speak publicly, the world discovered something disturbing about extreme trauma. It does not end when the situation that caused it ends. Many of these survivors reported that nightmares, dissociative episodes, the inability to form intimate relationships, all persisted 50, 60 years later. The brain that was rewired by trauma does not simply return to its previous state. Neural pathways formed under extreme stress remain, perhaps dormant, but easily reactivated by associated stimuli. An 80-year-old woman can experience a full-blown panic attack triggered by a smell, a sound, an image that her brain associates with the trauma from when she was 15. She is not recalling the trauma. She is reliving it with all the physiological intensity of the original event. This persistence of neurological trauma explains why victims of extreme psychological control often exhibit symptoms that seem contradictory to external observers. They can simultaneously defend their abusers and show terror at the possibility of returning to them. They can describe their captivity with clinical detachment and then emotionally break down over a minor detail. They can appear to function normally in most contexts and then become completely paralyzed by situations that require autonomous decision-making. These are not character inconsistencies. They are manifestations of a brain that was trained at a neurological level to operate in an environment of total control, and now must navigate a world that requires autonomy for which it is no longer equipped. The psychological experiments of the 20th century provide scientific context for understanding these phenomena. The Stanford Prison Experiment, although ethically questionable and methodologically imperfect, revealed how quickly ordinary people adopt guard and prisoner roles when placed in an authoritarian power structure. In less than a week, college students with no history of violence were applying systematic psychological cruelty to other students. The guards did not need training in control techniques. They discovered them intuitively. Public humiliation, arbitrary punishments, unpredictable rewards, destruction of privacy, forcing dependence. And the prisoners did not need years of conditioning to begin exhibiting symptoms of trauma. Some developed ulcers, others had emotional crises that required them to prematurely end their participation. The experiment had to be terminated after only 6 days because the situation had become too dangerous, too real. But those 6 days were enough to demonstrate something fundamental. Authoritarian power structures do not require inherently evil people to function. They simply require roles to be established, accountability to be eliminated, and dehumanization to be normalized. Once these elements are in place, ordinary people will carry out acts of psychological cruelty with the same ease as they would any other assigned task. Milgram's obedience to authority experiment confirms this conclusion from another angle. When a scientist in a white coat instructed participants to administer seemingly lethal electric shocks to another person, most obeyed. Not because they were sadistic, not because they lacked empathy, but because the authority structure had been established, because someone with apparent credibility assured them it was necessary, because responsibility had been transferred from them to the experimenter. The participant experienced visible distress, sweating, trembling, verbal protests, but most continued pressing the button. Authority had created a context where the natural impulse not to harm another human being could be overridden through simple instructions. These experiments shocked the psychological community and the public because they revealed that the potential for cruelty and blind obedience does not reside in a minority of monsters, but in the ordinary psychological structure of normal humans. Extreme control does not require exceptional perpetrators. It requires specific conditions: isolation of the victim, unquestionable authority of the perpetrator, progressive normalization of the abnormal, transfer of responsibility, gradual dehumanization of the victim. Once these conditions are established, control can be exercised by people who, outside of that context, would be considered completely normal, even kind. This takes us into deeply uncomfortable territories. Because if the potential to exercise extreme psychological control is more structural than individual, if it resides in systems rather than in people, then each of us operates within systems that contain these elements in various intensities. The question is not whether you are immune to exerting or suffering psychological control. The question is what intensity of these structural elements exists in the environments where you operate daily, and how much of your behavior is already being modulated by subtle versions of these mechanisms. Consider the modern corporate work environment. Isolation does not require physical walls when there is intense social pressure to fully identify with the organization. Unquestionable authority does not require dictators when there is a hierarchy where questioning higher decisions is punished through professional stagnation. The normalization of the abnormal occurs gradually when working hours extend imperceptibly, when work-life balance is incrementally eroded, when personal sacrifice for corporate objectives is celebrated as a virtue. The transfer of responsibility is complete when everyone executes their small part without ever confronting the system's total impact. Dehumanization is subtle when people become resources, human capital, numbers in productivity spreadsheets. Victims of toxic work environments exhibit symptoms surprisingly similar to victims of extreme psychological control, only at lower intensities. Chronic anxiety, difficulty making decisions outside of work, excessive identification with the employer, defending the system even when it clearly harms them, fierce competition with colleagues for marginal recognition, erosion of identity outside the professional role. This is not moral equivalence. An exploitative job is not equivalent to literal slavery, but the psychological mechanisms are structurally analogous, operating on a spectrum of intensity where the difference is more of degree than of kind. Abusive partner relationships reveal the same pattern with particular clarity because they occur in contexts of supposed intimacy and love. The abuser does not start with extreme violence. It begins with small erosions of autonomy that are presented as care. They progressively isolate you from friends and family under the pretext that only they truly understand you, that others would drive you away from them. They establish authority through a calculated alternation between devastating criticism that destroys your self-esteem and affirmations of love that make you feel that only with them do you have value. They normalize the abnormal through gradual escalation, where each new level of control is built upon the previous one, making each individual step seem small even while the total displacement is enormous. They transfer responsibility by convincing you that their behavior is a response to your flaws, that if only you behaved correctly, they wouldn't need to control you in this way. It subtly dehumanizes you by treating you as an object whose function is to satisfy its needs. And the victim, trapped in this system, exhibits exactly the behaviors we have documented in cases of extreme control. They defend the abuser in front of others. They rationalize the abuse as something they somehow deserve or provoke. They feel panic at the idea of leaving, not only out of fear of retaliation, but because their identity has become so fused with the relationship that they cannot conceive who they would be without it. They experience moments of clarity where they recognize the abuse, followed by periods of denial where they convince themselves they are exaggerating, that all marriages have problems, that they also have flaws. And when they finally escape, if they escape at all, they discover that physical liberation is only the first step in a recovery process that can last years or a lifetime. Children raised in abusive families inherit versions of these control patterns that operate at a generational level. They learn that love is conditional, that security is negotiable, that their value depends on satisfying unpredictable external expectations. These children grow up with brains literally rewired by childhood chronic stress. Their stress response system is permanently on alert. Their ability to regulate emotions is compromised. Their sense of autonomy is underdeveloped. And when they become adults, they often reproduce the same patterns, either by becoming abusers or by choosing abusive partners. Not because they are defective, but because their brain recognizes as familiar and therefore safe what is objectively dangerous. This intergenerational cycle of trauma and control is perhaps the most insidious aspect of the phenomenon. Extreme psychological control does not need to be reinvented in each generation. It is transmitted, inherited, and perpetuated through parenting patterns, family structures, and social norms that were originally established through explicit violence, but are now maintained through internalized social pressure. The person who was never physically abused, but grew up observing a parent's abuse of another, who internalized lessons about power and submission, about who has the right to autonomy and who does not, bears the marks of psychological control without having been directly its object. And here is where the analysis must become personal, where it must point directly at you. Because the temptation, when reading about extreme cases of psychological control, is to keep them at a safe distance. To convince yourself that they are aberrations, exceptions, monstrosities that occur on the margins of society to particularly vulnerable people by particularly malicious individuals. But that distance is illusory. The mechanisms we have dissected are not exceptional. They are variations in intensity of dynamics that operate in most social structures, in most power relations, in most contexts where hierarchy and dependence exist. The only relevant question is how much of your daily behavior is being modulated by subtle versions of these mechanisms. How many of your decisions are motivated by fear of consequences that you have never critically examined? How much of your identity is built on expectations that you internalized without questioning? How many times have you defended systems or people that harm you because the alternative, recognizing that you have been operating under external control, is too destabilizing for your sense of autonomy? How many of the voices in your head that sound like yours are actually echoes of authorities that conditioned you in moments of vulnerability? Because if there is a lesson that emerges from all these cases of extreme psychological control, it is this: perfect control does not feel like control. It feels like personal choice, like natural preference, like the obvious way of being. The most fully controlled victims are the ones who will passionately defend that they are free. And the ultimate proof of how deep the control is lies in your reaction to any suggestion that you are not as free as you think. If your first response is defensiveness, rationalization, immediate search for reasons why you are different, why your situation is the exception, then perhaps that very response is evidence of how effectively you have internalized the voices that control you. The extreme cases we have examined are not warnings about distant monsters. They are mirrors that reflect, amplified to become undeniable, the dynamics that subtly operate in contexts you consider normal. And the final question, the one that should keep you awake, is not whether these dynamics exist. Clearly, they do. The question is whether you have the courage to recognize where they exist in your own life, and if, after that recognition, you will do anything about it. Knowing that perhaps the most honest, the most terrifying answer is that you will do exactly nothing. Because recognizing the chains and choosing to stay with them is infinitely more comfortable than facing the terror of true freedom, with all its unbearable responsibilities and paralyzing uncertainties.